back in Edmonton. I was in Calgary not too long ago when Danielle Smith was selected the leader of the United Conservative Party, taking over from Jason Kenney, who incredibly didn't even finish his first term as premier, going from the leading Conservative politician in Canada, one thrown out by his own party. Danielle Smith squeaked out a majority. There was a ranked ballot system. In the end, she got about 54% of the party's support, and her closest successor, 46. That's not a overwhelming win like Pierre Poilievre had federally, but then again, there were 7 candidates. Danielle Smith was also an outsider. She was not a sitting MLA, and it'll be tricky for her to negotiate being premier of a caucus that is not hers. Those MLAs were picked by Jason Kenney. The cabinet ministers were picked by Jason Kenney. Many of the programs that Danielle Smith has railed against were implemented by the very MLAs and cabinet ministers she now has to cobble together into her own party. It reminds me a little bit of when Stockwell Day succeeded Preston Manning to lead the Reform Party of Canada. Actually, then it was called the Canadian Alliance. Preston Manning never in a million years thought he would lose, and he couldn't stomach the loss to Stockwell Day. Again, an outsider who was not part of caucus, and soon there was a bit of a civil war against him. Danielle Smith has to keep that party together as she gets ready to fight Rachel Notley, the NDP former premier, who actually thinks she can be returned to power. It has been a choppy time for Danielle Smith. Now, some of that is expected. Of course, the media party hates her. Of course, the NDP war room and their proxies and the big labor unions hate her. Of course. But it's the same way for Pierre Poilievre federally. Of course, the Liberal Party and the media party hate him, but he seems to be more ready for the battle than Danielle Smith has been. Now, I like Danielle Smith. I have had some qualms with her over the years, but of the 7 candidates, I felt she was the strongest and the one who would be the most caring and devoted to Alberta's interests. I think that was one of the reasons why Jason Kenney failed as premier. Number one, of course, he enforced brutal lockdowns, including against truckers and against Christian churches and business people like Chris Scott. But also, he didn't stand up for the province of Alberta. I think Kenney was always looking for the next chance where maybe he would run for prime minister in 5 years. And so he was always thinking, what do I do now in Alberta? How will it look in 5 years when I'm trying to explain myself to the CBC? I don't want to be too Alberta first. I don't want to be too critical of Canada. So Danielle Smith, to me, met those 2 check boxes. She was the most freedom-oriented of the 7 candidates and the most pro-Alberta. So how is she doing? Has either of those issues blown up on her? Well, you be the judge. The first thing was Danielle Smith made a statement in a press conference saying that unvaccinated people were subject to the worst discrimination that she has observed in her lifetime. Here, I'll let you see her say it herself. It was quite a press conference. Take a look.
The community that faced the most restrictions on their freedoms in the last year were those who made a choice not to be vaccinated. I don't think I've ever experienced a situation in my lifetime where a person was fired from their job, or not allowed to watch their kids play hockey, or not allowed to go visit a loved one in long-term care or hospital, or not allowed to go get on a plane to either go across the country to see family or even travel across the border. So they have been the most discriminated against group that I've ever witnessed in my lifetime. That's a pretty extreme level of discrimination that we have seen. I don't take away any of the discrimination that I've seen in those other groups that you mentioned, but this has been an extraordinary time in the last year in particular. And I want people to know that I find that unacceptable, that we are not going to create a segregated society on the basis of a medical choice.
Now, I happen to think that that's exactly true. She didn't say the worst civil liberties bonfire in global history or even in Canada's history. I mean, you look at the Second World War and the Holocaust. If you look at atrocities throughout history, of course, the lockdowns of the last 2 years don't stack up. But in her lifetime, I mean, we've had civil rights in Canada. We've had gay rights in Canada for, 20 years or so. We've had, in terms of equal marriage. I mean, what civil liberties, atrocities or discriminations are there in Canada for women, for visible minorities, for gay people in her lifetime that are comparable to unvaccinated people being fired from their work, banned from the public square, banned from restaurants, told they can't get on airplanes, and just the lockdowns themselves, limiting weddings and funerals, closing churches. What Danielle Smith said was 100% right. And her promise to add unvaccinated people to the list of protected grounds in the Human Rights Code, I think, is brilliant. The people who jumped on that are the same people who were the human rights abusers. If you accuse lockdown extremists and public health extremists and hypochondriacs and Munchausen by proxy public officers of being human rights violators, don't be surprised if they squawk at you for it. Don't be surprised if for the first time anyone's pushed back at them in 2 years, they're going to roar in outrage. It was expected that they would object to her categorizing their public policy as discrimination. Of course they did. That is not surprising at all. What was surprising and a little bit disappointing to me is that Danielle Smith bent the knee. She apologized and reached out and said she rededicates herself to anti-racism and tolerance. Well, what's that got to do with the fact that unvaccinated people were, as a matter of fact, banned from things that Black people or women or other minorities were not banned from? Now, Black and other minorities who were unvaccinated had the same bullying. You know, when I look back at the sweep of Canadian history, I think, for example, of the Japanese internment in British Columbia, which was atrocious, but it was more limited than and it was both in terms of geography and class. That was an abomination to human rights. There were other abominations to human rights, but none of those were in our lifetime. That was almost 100 years ago. What Danielle Smith said was factually true, and it was a reasonable opinion. More to the point, it's something that she essentially campaigned on. Of course, the establishment rejected it, but the fact that she apologized so quickly worries me, not just for the substance of it, but can she stand up to these vested interests? I'm pleased to say that Danielle Smith sacked the public health officer, Dina Hinshaw. Here's a clip of that. Good. So she's not afraid to take on the public health officer. She said she'll take on Alberta Health Services. Great. But can you not take on the commentariat who squawks because you point out the truth? The emperor has no clothes. It was a gross violation of our human rights. Don't take my word for it. Take it from the deposed premier, Jason Kenney, who, when asked by Rebel News reporters about vaccine passports, said those would violate the law. Here is Jason Kenney saying it would be a civil rights violation before he went along and violated those civil rights. Well, it happened once, but then it happened a second time. Danielle Smith, when she was a journalist, gave her opinions on the war in Ukraine. Now, it's a very complicated situation, and it's somewhat dangerous, I suppose, for lay people to give their opinions on the subject, but she was a lay person. She was not premier. She was a journalist. It was in a call-in show. And she said two things. She said she thought, and she made these comments on TV and she tweeted them. She suggested that Ukraine perhaps ought to remain neutral, sort of like Finland. It's right next to Russia, doesn't want to be dominated by Russia, but it would be perhaps too provocative to join NATO. Now, does that sound like an extreme opinion? Well, it could be, but that just happens to be the opinion of Henry Kissinger, perhaps the wisest or most experienced, you don't have to call him wise, but the most experienced diplomat still living, an advisor to various presidents. That's the view of many UK former diplomats. That's probably how this war is going to end, some sort of military neutrality for Ukraine. That's what Elon Musk is talking about. It's a legitimate point of view. To have Ukraine join NATO right abutting Russia would probably cause Russia to continue its invasion. I'm not saying that Danielle Smith is right, but I'm saying it's a legitimate point of view to have, especially for a journalist. What you just saw was an excerpt from my nightly show, the Ezra Levant Show. Every weekday, I do a monologue. Usually it's about half an hour. Then I interview an interesting guest, and then we read my hate mail or my fan mail, whichever is more fun. It's only available behind a paywall, though. That's how we pay our bills here at Rebel News. We don't take a dime from Justin Trudeau. But the good news is it's only $8 a month, about half the price of Netflix. And in addition to my nightly show, You also get weekly shows from 4 other friends here at Rebel News. So you're getting 36 shows a month just for $8. I think it's worth it. And even if you're not quite sure, do it anyways, because we rely on viewers like you to keep us free and independent. I promise you I'll never take a dime from Trudeau. Just go to rebelnewsplus.com and click subscribe. Thanks.